Hey folks, David Stewart here. We're going to talk about the problem with prequels. Before I get to that, don't forget, check the description box. Get yourself a signed copy of King Leper. Limited edition. Very limited edition. I promise you, if you buy it off Amazon, it'll be a different edition. Probably a different color, too. Anyway, let's talk about the problem with prequels. The big problem with prequels really is that you are making them after you make the originals, but they take place before. So they're always referencing things that chronologically come later in the story. And that creates some problems with telling stories. It disrupts your ability to tell a story in the most appropriate way for that story. There's lots of different examples for this. The biggest two that I can think of are the Star Wars prequels as well as the Hobbit trilogy. The Hobbit is a short book, 100 and something thousand words. It's fairly short compared to even the first book of Lord of the Rings, and yet we split it up into three movies that were almost as long as the original Lord of the Rings movies, and were just not as well liked, and I think there's good reason for that. They were made as prequels. They weren't made as adaptations of The Hobbit. They were made as prequels to the Lord of the Rings movies, and therein lies the problem. Let's look at the Star Wars prequels. I'm sure you guys have seen these. You have Episode 1 is probably just such a great example of the problem with prequels, is that Episode 1 is full of tie-ins and references to the original three movies which came out in the late 70s and early 80s. Okay? It's just jam-packed full of them. Because it comes afterwards, the nature of sequels is that you're building on and referencing material that came before and maybe bringing it into new directions or higher stakes and things like that. Well, what's the problem with Episode 1? We have C-3PO, right? We have C-3PO being built by Anakin Skywalker. Well, that's weird, and he doesn't have armor. Why? Why do we need C-3PO in this? Well, we need to have an origin for C-3PO. We have to reference C-3PO because C-3PO was in the previous three movies we already made. Whereas if we had shot them in order, C-3PO probably wouldn't have been there at all. Or if he had been, he would have just been a random protocol droid that, like, the princess had. And no one would have thought twice about it. Like, what is C-3PO's origins? It's like, why does this matter? Well, I'm writing an origin story for Anakin. So clearly C-3PO needs an origin as well. It's like, not really. You didn't think he needed an origin when you shot the original movie in 1976 and 77 is when it came out. But when you shot the original movie, you didn't think C-3PO and R2-D2 needed an origin. They were just there. They were just characters, right? But because we're having to kind of backwards reference them, we're having to future reference them, we start to create origins for them. The first time we meet R2 is on that, you're a good little robot, R2, thank you, right? We can't just have them be with R2 from the beginning. We'd be like, well, where did R2 come from? Well, he's a droid. He was built at a droid factory. C-3PO was built at a droid factory. Like, does that matter? Like, where did I get my phone? It was made in the factory that makes phones. But we have to have that. And then we have lots of other little references to the original three movies as those things progress. You find plans for the Death Star. You have really obvious references to to who would become the Emperor, lots of things like that. And because Episode 1 got so full of having to reference stuff from the original movies, I think it ended up a pretty jumbled mess as far as plot goes. There was just too many things there. Rather than having Anakin exist with his own life, he exists as an inversion and foil of Darth Vader, the scary monster from the original movies. So why did George Lucas feel the need to have him start as an innocent child? Well, to show how an innocent child could become Darth Vader. But you already made Darth Vader, so why does that matter? If you had shot them Episode 1 as the first movie, you probably would not have had a boy Anakin Skywalker. You would have had a young leading man that could have actually, made the movie work and made some of the really sillier parts of the movie less necessary, like him accidentally blowing up the droid control ship, things like that. Things that just really push the limits of what you're willing to suspend your disbelief for, what you're willing to accept. Really just takes you out of the movie. Like this, it's just incredulous, right? You have this incredulous feeling watching Anakin accidentally blow up like a giant ship and like save everyone on accident, right? Things like that. There's all these kinds of things. You have to reference what comes later. So you have to have Anakin and Padme interact in a certain way when they first meet, because you're going to get them together later. And you already know that because you already shot 3 movies. When you look at something like the Hobbit trilogy, yeah, it's jam-packed with the need to reference the original movies. Why is Legolas jammed into the Hobbit when he's not there in the original books? Well, because he technically was there in the Hobbit, right? He lived in the woodland realm, hanging out with Thranduil, whose name we never get in the Hobbit. He's just the Elven King, if you read the book. I don't think we get his name at all. But he would have been there, so you could have had a cameo with Orlando Bloom, him standing next to his dad as Thorin is questioned. But instead, we have to have him in there. Like, okay, well, we need to put someone from these other movies in here. We have to, just like how with a sequel, you have to have characters continue on. Well, we got to have Legolas. We got to have more characters. So we're just gonna what can we do to have him exist in this movie? Oh, we'll make a love triangle. We'll invent a character out of thin air that wasn't there and doesn't serve any purpose to the main plot goals, and we will create a love triangle between him and Legolas, or between Legolas and a dwarf and this girl. You know, it really like just adds a whole lot of fluff. No wonder you end up stretching this thing out to 3 movies, because you just have to keep adding references in. There's a pretty good YouTube video I watched a long time ago that's like the references extend not just to having to have references to characters and references to places and Elrond and like things like that, but also to like duplicate the shots even that you had in the original movie, right? This sort of cinematic style that existed in Fellowship of the Ring, you have that in the Hobbit movies as well. But when it's not necessary, you start adding in characters like, well, we need an orc to chase them because we had an orc chasing them in Fellowship of the Ring, and that worked. So we need to invent an antagonist when it's really an Odyssey format. It's because it's an Odyssey format. You don't need an active antagonist, but it's like, but we had like antagonists in the first movie, so we should add one in this one. You end up duplicating the format of the originals when the story that you're trying to adapt just doesn't have that format. It just doesn't fit in the same way at all. I think they're both Odyssey format as far as plot goes, but The Hobbit is a much more classic direct thing. You go to this area, there's a new challenge to overcome. You overcome it, you move on to the next area until you get to your final goal and have the adventures there. It's a need to, like, I don't know, screenwriting class it. Like, I took a class in screenwriting and you have to have all these things. But the Hobbit book doesn't have these. Why do people like this? We better add these things in because otherwise people won't enjoy the movie if it doesn't fit my screenwriting manual and my screenwriting workshop's guide to writing screenplays. If I don't write it the way that the screenwriting workshop said to, then no one will like this movie. It's like, they probably would, because it's a great classic story. And just because people use things frequently doesn't mean you have to use them in every movie. You can do something original or different or outside of that box, but they didn't do that. You know, they chose to kind of make an imitation of those original 3 movies. So that's the problem with prequels. Because you make them after movies which come later in the chronology, sort of the internal chronology of the universe, you end up having to make a lot of weird references that don't fit in or disrupt the flow of the story. Are all prequels bad? No, absolutely not. I will tell you that I have written prequels of a sort, right? I've written books that take place in earlier times and later times for books, right? I've written like Crown of Sight, All Shall Fall, though those take place in like a mythic past, to like my main Eternal Dream books, Water Up Awakening, Needle Ash, and now King Leper, which you can get a signed, you can get an autographed hardback mailed to you. So check the Kickstarter link down below. Then there's Moonsong, which takes place in another age, right? So there's prequels, right? Silmarillion, I don't know how much of it was really composed after Lord of the Rings, but maybe that qualifies as prequel stuff. But it's not there constantly having to reference little things about Lord of the Rings. I know that Michael Moorcock has written interquels and prequels for Elric stuff, and generally it turns out okay, right? Because he is just writing a story about Elric, and he's not getting hyper-focused on having to reference Stormbringer, which he already wrote and published before that. So as long as you're not trying to reference it for the fans, like create lots of little tie-ins with something that you already had and just let the story breathe of its own life, I think prequels can be fine. I think book prequels tend to do it better for that reason. You also have a lot more room to make those connections and not disrupt the flow of the to not disrupt the flow of the story. You can make a reference in the prose very quickly with a couple sentences. It doesn't disrupt anything and makes all the connections you need to make. Whereas in a movie, you have to visually do it. You have to do it through dialogue. You have less space to make those references and keep the entire narrative intact. So that can also be an issue, I think, compared to, for instance, books. So no, not all prequels are bad. I don't think they're necessarily destined to be bad or anything like that. Prequel games are not necessarily bad either. KOTOR is a super ultra prequel to all of Star Wars, and it's full of references of Star Wars. It feels very Star Wars, but that doesn't disrupt the game. You don't have to stop and have a bunch of chapters about Luke Skywalker because he doesn't exist for another 2,000 years. So you have lightsabers and stuff. You have the basic setting stuff, and you just go barrel through the story and the gameplay with that, and it works great. So no, I don't think it's destined, but that's where a lot of prequels end up. And I'm sure you could think of some other examples, like a prequel series to this or a prequel series to that, that have been a thing here because we just keep recycling the same intellectual properties over and over again now. So leave me some examples down below in the comment section. I'd love to read them. I'll check you all next time. Be sure to grab the new book and have a great day.